All right, so let me give you a quick overview of where we're going during the 8 weeks, and hopefully that'll give you an idea. That this has to be a little bit flexible because we'll see how it goes. But anyway, last week we did an introduction to Amos, and we learned about the roaring of God's voice. And tonight we're going to do a little bit more with Amos. I promised we would analyze further the incident in Amos 7 that we looked at last week, so we'll do that. And I want to introduce a topic called the left hand of God tonight that you may or may not have heard of before. And then next week, I will finish the left hand of God and we'll begin Hosea. And make sure everyone's got their mics muted, please. And then the following week, we'll probably spend the whole session on Hosea again. And then the week after that, Jonah and Micah. And then April 13th and 20th, Isaiah. And then the last week, probably wrapping up some things and dealing with questions and that kind of thing. Now, you're probably wondering, where are the rest of the prophetic books? And I made an executive decision this week that simply is too much material, 17 prophetic books, and I'm trying to lay a foundation in the prophetic books. So it's just too much to try to jam everything in and do kind of a superficial job. So what I've decided to do is to tackle what are called the Assyrian prophets, the prophets who prophesied during the time of Assyria in this 8 weeks. And then perhaps in the fall or next spring, we'll come back with part 2 and do more of the prophets. So I've had to adjust my goals a little bit as I've gotten into this, because I really want to make sure a good foundation is being laid. And so we're going to slow down, take our time. We'll do these prophets in these 8 weeks, and then come back again for a part 2 of prophetic books, either next fall or perhaps next spring. So anyway, that's kind of what the schedule looks like now. And what I'd like to do is just based on Amos's words last week, I'd like to give a little prayer from that I think maybe Amos would pray, which would go something like this. "O Lord, as you spoke with such convincing authority to Amos, I ask that you would roar in my ears. May the sound of your voice be clear and unmistakable, filling me with a passion for the things about which you are most zealous. Deliver me from trivial religious pursuits, arrogant prejudices, and my own attachments. Fill me with annoyance over that which brings you displeasure. Give me joy over the things that cause you delight. May I discern the audience that you give me, the platform you have provided, and the specific message you call me to declare, so that I may have the wisdom to publicly proclaim what you tell me in secret." If you were a part of the class last week, you see little bits and pieces there that are echoes of things that Amos said that we covered last week. Now, what I want to do is do a quick review on the tools, just to make sure everybody's up to speed. And this is the first tool. And all 4 of these tools, by the way, are available in Word documents. Just email me. Many of you have already done that. The second tool is the tuning fork. And we'll come back to both of these tools tonight. The third tool is the use of maps. We'll also use that tonight and in the coming weeks. And then a fourth tool that I used last week, I didn't call it a tool, but we'll call it that, is the order of the books. And you can see here that we have the canonical order of the 17 books. Really, Lamentations is not technically a prophetic book, but it fits in there. And so it's part of the grouping. And I've reorganized them in a more chronological order, as you can see. And so, for instance, with our look at Amos last week, that changes the position that Amos has. It moves him up earlier, moves Jeremiah and Lamentations, Ezekiel, so forth, further down the list because they come later. And so the point of this, of course, is if you really want to get the prophetic books with clarity, you want to read them in order. And so we moderns think of chronological sequence, and the ancients didn't always do that, but it's important to us. And so the chronology can be helpful. And then these are broken into three groups. The first is prophets that prophesied during the Assyrian period. And then the second is the prophets that prophesied during the Babylonian period. And the third is prophets that prophesied during the Persian period. So those are the way that they break down. And those three groupings we'll come back to tonight and explore just a little bit more, because those are very helpful and important in laying a foundation in understanding the prophetic books. Now, I want to go back to the list of the monarchs for just a moment. You see what we've got here. On the left are northern monarchs, on the right are southern. They have the prefixes that are the little codes in front of each one of them. The ones on the right are all in the Davidic dynasty. They're all descendants of David. On the left, they are a hodgepodge of some short dynasties of 3 or 4 kings, and sometimes just whoever can kill the previous king gets to be king for a day or a year, or that kind of thing. So it's kind of Wild West on the northern side, and on the southern side, it's very orderly, at least in terms of the Davidic monarchy. You can see then the S and the N, that means these are northern or southern kings. And we can refer to them, for instance, Rehoboam as S1, that kind of thing. We have 2 Jeroboams. Just a couple of things on this list to help avoid confusion. We have 2 Jeroboams. Both feature tonight and feature in the story of Amos 7. And so it's important when we're reading our Bibles to distinguish these 2 guys. And then we also have 2 Ahaziahs. And that's where sometimes we get a little confused. And so having this printed out, as I suggested, I have mine laminated and it's in my Bible all the time. It can be helpful in figuring out who we're looking at when we're reading, especially in Kings, First and Second Kings and Chronicles. There are 2 Jehoahazes as well. You see how confusing it can be. And then there are 2 Joashes. Now you see in 12 is called Jehoash here, but many modern translations just translate him as Joash also, which would give us 2 Joashes. And then we have Athaliah. She's the only queen of the 39 monarchs. She happens to be the daughter of Ahab, which adds a very interesting wrinkle to her story in 2 Kings 9, 10, 11 in theirs. And then we have S10, who is Uzziah, but in 2 Kings, he's called Azariah. Now, I know everyone wants to throw their hands up in despair, but no, you're less confused now than you were before, because I've told you these things. And so you have a better idea then of some of the issues that confront you when you think about these kings. So hopefully this is helpful to you and you can review it on your own as well. Now, let me give you a quick quiz. Here's a verse, 2 Kings 14:1. No one needs to answer this out loud, but just think to yourself, if you were reading in 2 Kings 14:1, said in the 2nd year of Joash, son of Joahaz, king of Israel, Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, became king. Now, that is a confusing verse at first glance. Who are these guys? You got 2 Joashes. And one is the son of Joahaz, and the other is the father of Amaziah. So what do we do here? Well, if you look at your king list, you sort it out. Most of you have probably already figured it out, that the Joash in yellow is in 12, and the Joash in blue is S8. All right, so this is where the King's List can sometimes sort these things out for us. One more test, 2 Kings 15:1. In the 27th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Azariah, the son of Amaziah, king of Judah, became king. Now, remember, there's two Jeroboams. Which one is it referring to? And who is this guy, Azariah, the son of Amaziah? And you probably figure that out because I kind of touched on this a little bit already. But the Jeroboam is in 13, not in 1, in 13. And Azariah is actually S10 Uzziah. All right, so nobody ever said studying portions of the Bible are always going to be easy, but when you have the right tools, you can sort through these things and then you have a better understanding of what's going on. I actually, in my Bible, I have a 4-color pen and I write in the margin next to all the northern kings in green. I write what they are in terms of their code, and next to the southern kings in red. And that way, every time I'm reading, I've got it right there. And if that helps you, I'm a visual learner, that sure helps me, then fine. One more observation on tools, and then we'll get started here. And that's the tuning fork. I just wanted to go back to it for a moment. These are the basic elements that are components. Now, there's much more, and tonight we will add more to it. But I want you to just see it in its simplicity. It may not look simple to you, but if you were in class last week, it looks simpler perhaps tonight than it did last week. And a lot of this is simply a matter of acquiring comfort by looking at things more than once and just getting familiar with them. So it's a learning curve. I understand that. Hopefully you can kind of see that it is a learning curve, and this is the general overview of the tuning fork. Now that brings us to a very important, helpful way of looking at the prophetic books, and that is the 4 eras of the prophetic books. You see, we want to know the historical context of these prophets. As I said last week, if we don't know the historical context, we know nothing about, say, the Civil War. We don't know if it came before the Revolutionary War or afterwards or before the Spanish-American War. We're just kind of out there with this piece of information. There was a war, but we can't situate it in anything that makes sense to us. That's part of our problem with the prophetic books, is we need some more information that kind of provides boundaries or rails to keep us on track and help us figure out what's going on with these prophetic books. So here's a little bit about the 4 eras of the prophetic books. We'll look at them in terms of their era, what prophets prophesied during them, and how they connect with the historical books. And by historical books, I mean other books in the Old Testament, like, say, 1st and 2nd Kings or Chronicles or Ezra and Nehemiah, that kind of thing that might correlate with the prophets. So the first era is what I call pre-canonical or non-canonical. That's just a fancy term for those who did not write scripture. These are speaking prophets primarily, and they didn't write. And then we have the Neo-Assyrian era and the Neo-Babylonian era, and these are called Neo because there were previous Assyrian and Babylonian empires. For instance, Hammurabi was a king in the earlier Babylonian Empire, but that was like 1,000 years before Amos. And so we're talking about the Neo-Assyrian, the revived Assyrian, the revived Babylonian Empire, and then the Persian era. So these 17 prophetic books that we're looking at fit in one of these last 3, Neo-Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, and Persian. And if we can place them properly, we can begin to say, oh, I understand what their issues were. And so we'll look more carefully at that, but here we go. For instance, you're wondering, what is a pre-canonical or non-canonical prophet? Well, Abraham's called a prophet, Moses was, Miriam is a prophetess, Balaam, Deborah, Huldah, Nathan, Elijah, Elisha. These are the kinds of people that are considered pre-canonical or non-canonical. Then we have the Neo-Assyrian era, and here you have 6 clear prophetic books, Isaiah, Micah, Hosea, Amos, Jonah, and Nahum, and the historical books that parallel their time. And sometimes we forget that because the prophetic books are at the close of the Old Testament, so we think they must be much later than anything that preceded them, but sometimes the prophetic books parallel the historical books in terms of their history. The third, the Neo-Babylonian, would be books like Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Obadiah, Habakkuk, Zephaniah. And there are prophetic books that parallel them as well. And then finally, there is the Persian era, and that involves Daniel. I put Joel in there. Joel is very difficult to date. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. And they parallel Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. And of course, you can see Daniel overlaps between the Neo-Babylonian and the Persian era as well. So these last three, these numbers 2, 3, and 4, sometimes called classical prophets. And how that term came about, I'm not sure, but that's what they're called. And if you want to distinguish the non-canonical prophets from the classical prophets, then fine. I don't know if that helps you or just adds confusion, but anyway, that's what they're called. Now, the question is, for the prophets that prophesied during each of these time periods, what was their mindset? What was going on in their world that would affect their message and shape what they had to say? And so let's take a look, first of all, at the non-canonical prophets. And these guys are just, in general, spokespeople for God. They're passionate for God. They speak for God. Remember, they don't always have to predict future events. Prophets don't always predict or only predict. Sometimes they forthtell and sometimes they foretell. So we shouldn't be looking at the prophets simply as those who tell the future. And they rise above human events and time periods in a general way, but nevertheless, they are spokespeople. God whispers in their ear like he did with Amos, only he roared in Amos's ear, and then they go and act upon that. So that would be the pre-canonical prophets. The Neo-Assyrian prophets are in a different historical context. They understand what's happening. They can read their map and know the history and see what's happening in their world. And they recognize that Assyria is a threat. And they can see that, furthermore, that Israel has violated the terms of the covenant they have with God, and that God is not pleased with that. And so these prophets will warn Israel that Assyria is coming and they're going to go into exile and they will be punished for their spiritual adultery. The term spiritual adultery is a key idea. We'll look at it next week in the context of the book of Hosea. Jeremiah also talks about that. Some of these prophets, like Isaiah, are court prophets. Much of his prophecy, or a lot of his prophecy, was done with kings. He had access to the court. And so he would advise the kings. And basically, one of his big advices to Ahaz, for instance, was don't make any alliances with foreign nations. Just stand pat and wait for God to act. The Babylonian era prophets have a little bit different situation. They have seen the collapse of the northern kingdom. They've seen the devastation that Assyria wrought on their sister to the north, Israel. And so they are anticipating Assyria's collapse because they can also see that Babylon is emerging. Habakkuk is a great one to help us see that. And so they warn Judah that what happened to their sister in the north, Israel, is going to happen to them too. And the prophets marvel that they can't seem to learn from Israel and change their ways. And then the Persian prophets are, again, in a unique situation. The Persian monarchs recognized that it was to their advantage to let the exiles return home. Israel and Judea were a wasteland. Everything was in ruins. It was producing nothing. If they let the exiles go back, they can rebuild it, they can reestablish the economy, and that's good for Persia.
So she can take care of him.
Can you mute your mic, whoever that is? And furthermore, Persia was so persuaded of that they actually funded Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah as they would go back to Judah and seek to rebuild. Same with Nehemiah. And so these prophets had some hope, but they were more focused not on exile, but upon getting Judah and the temple and the cities and the economy reestablished. So they each have their context. Now, each of these can be seen in the tool of the tuning fork also. And I just want to keep going back to that so you see how useful this tool can be. So for instance, we look at the tuning fork, you see the pre-canonical, non-canonical prophets there. They're the non-writing prophets. And then we get the second era, which is the Assyrian period. And there's where it fits in the tuning fork. And that period comes to an end with the fall of the capital city, Nineveh, in 612. That fall is brought about by Babylon. And so Babylon comes along, topples Nineveh and Assyria, and will survive for not many years until in 539, Babylon is taken without even a battle by the Persians. And the Persians will come and they will do what I just said. They will allow the exiles to return, and the Persian period will come to an end with the rise of the Greek Empire. So that's a way then to look.
I'm sure people would give. Yes.
That's a way to look at the tuning fork and integrate this information into it. Then in addition, another thing we can do is simply show where the books fit. And so you can see how each of these 17 books relate to different historical periods of the in relationship to the tuning fork. All right, so I'm giving you this repeatedly in different ways because hopefully something you see might say, make a light go on, say, oh, well, now it makes sense, or I can use that. And some of us are not very visual learners. My wife keeps reminding me she's not a visual learner, so I understand that's the case. But for those who are visual like myself, hopefully this helps. Now we can go to the list of the monarchs. And here we can see, for instance, the green is where Assyria is having an effect on the northern and southern kingdoms and the prophets who prophesied during that time. And you see that 722 circled in red, that's the end of the northern kingdom with the Assyrian exile. And then the yellow is the Babylonian influence. And so the last 5 kings of the southern kingdom are all under heavy pressure from Babylon. In many cases, these last kings, both with Assyria and with Babylon, are actually vassal states. They're already paying huge taxes and sending tribute to these kings just so that Assyria or Babylon won't immediately destroy them. So it's a very vulnerable situation. So hopefully we're starting to see a little bit about how the prophetic books are related then to what's going on in the world around them. One of the ways to really visualize this, and I think this will be the last way that I'll do this with the tuning fork, is to show, first of all, what's happening with Israel, and then bring in these 5 empires. And you can see then that all of these empires are having a huge impact upon what's going on within the kingdom. Israel does not stand alone. It's a very complex situation, and it's not just even these 5 kingdoms. You've got the northern kingdom wanting to make alliances with Assyria or Syria, which is not even on our chart. So there's a lot of political and military interplay. It's a very tense period. Everybody's jockeying for position. Everybody wants help from Egypt. Egypt is at times very strong. Will they come and help us? And so this is a very uncertain period. And if you live in an uncertain period, you can really appreciate the prophetic books. They have a lot to say about what God's people do during uncertain times when things seem to be beyond their control. And in this situation, things are beyond the control of the kings of Israel. Now, I want to shift gears here. Last week, I promised that we would return to Amos 7 for one more look because there are some unanswered questions there. And so if you have your Bibles, you can turn back to Amos 7 if you wish. I'll put some verses on the screen as well. But, and as you can see there on the right, we have this all ushering into the fullness of times. All of this is preparatory. And we will talk about how this is all preparatory for the coming of Christ as well, and how God is at work in the midst of this. But for now, I want us to look at Amos 7 one more time. We spent some time on this passage last week, where Amaziah, Jeroboam, and the city of Bethel are all under Amos's scathing denunciation. And the questions that should be asked here is, what made it necessary for Amos to leave his flocks and fig trees and go to undertake this miserable calling to be a prophet of the Lord? And who is Jeroboam, and why is Bethel important, and why is he up at Bethel, and why didn't he go somewhere else, and who cares about this guy Amaziah anyway? And those are the questions that we can rightly ask as we read scripture, because we want to understand. Obviously, it's there for a reason. Now, the lesson here is this: decisions have consequences. We're going to see a decision that is made that has enormous consequences. And the decisions basically have seeds that are planted by these unwise choices that will bear bitter fruit in years to come. So what happens in Amos 7 is basically revealing to us the results of something that happened over a century and a half earlier. So let's look at Amos 7. And the context, the setup for this is found in 1 Kings 12. You need to turn back there. But in 931 BC, Solomon died. And the northern tribes of Israel were fed up with his obsessive building of cities and temples and conscripting free labor to get the work done. They're just fed up with Solomon. And there was unhappiness also because Israel and Judah were undergoing drastic cultural and social changes. And there was further tribal disunity that resurfaced when Saul died. David had to take 7 years to reunify the north and the south after Saul died. Now Solomon has died, and we got another fracture. And so Rehoboam comes along, Solomon's son, and he's just too arrogant and stupid to recognize the signs of the times. That's the setup for this story. And so we then can look at a map real quick just to get the setting here. And you can see that blue line represents how the northern and southern kingdoms would be divided at that point between the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. And so the southern kingdom of Judah, Rehoboam would be the king, and his capital obviously would be Jerusalem. And the northern would be Israel, and Jeroboam the first is the king at the death of Solomon, and his capital will be Shechem. So this is the setting now for the story that we're about to see. And you can, while you're looking at that map, you can spot Bethel a little bit above Jerusalem. That's where Amos is going to go. So, let's dive into this story then. In 1 Kings 12, at the death of Solomon, the northern tribe gives Rehoboam advice. It says, look, if you'll just be a halfway reasonable person, we'll submit to your authority. Rehoboam would not listen to them. He wouldn't take their advice. And so then the people said, that is, the people in the northern kingdom said, well, we have nothing to do with David then. We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Everybody go to your tents. That means go home, get away from here. Look after your own house, David. David meaning Rehoboam, the grandson of David. So Israel departed to their tents. So Rehoboam then is actually forced to flee back home, as we see here, because then he sent his right-hand man named Adoram, who was over the forced labor. Notice that he still wants to conscript labor. He doesn't get it. Israel stones Adoram to death, and Rehoboam has to hurry and get on his chariot and get back to Jerusalem before they kill him too. And so Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. So then, when Israel had heard that Jeroboam had returned, that is, he had come from Egypt. You see, he had fled to Egypt under Solomon because he was in charge of the forced labor under Solomon, and he was a somewhat bold and upright person. And he just said, look, Solomon, this is ridiculous. The people are unhappy. You're working everybody to death. We got to do something about it. Solomon put a contract on his head, and Jeroboam had to flee to Egypt for his life. And he'd been down there until Solomon died. Well, when Jeroboam got the word of what was going on, he comes back. And the northern tribes send for him, and they called him and made him king over all Israel. Only Judah followed the house of David. So the split is complete, but that's not the end of the story, and that's not why we're looking at this, because it's what Jeroboam does next that becomes so important. Jeroboam's got a problem, and his problem is very simple. He doesn't have Jerusalem. Rehoboam has Jerusalem. It's in the south. He doesn't have any leverage for his people in terms of tradition or religion, worship. And so in 1 Kings 12:26, Jeroboam says, everybody's going to go back to Judah, to the house of David, because they're going to want to go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. And when they do, their heart will return to Rehoboam. They're going to like it, not because they like Rehoboam as much as they like Jerusalem. They like the idea of the temple. And so they'll kill me, and they'll all return to Rehoboam, king of Judah, just like the northern tribes eventually conceded to David after the death of Saul. So Jeroboam has this huge problem. What's he going to do about it? So he gets his advisors together, and he consults, and he has a stroke of genius. He makes 2 golden calves. And he says to the people, is it too much for you? It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. You don't have to go to Jerusalem to worship. Look, right here in front of you are your gods, O Israel, that brought you up from the land of Egypt. Well, just pause there for a second, because this decision will have enormous consequences. And when we come to Amos 7, we find that Amos has to deal with this problem. So he makes these 2 golden calves, and then he makes the strategic decision to put one of them in Bethel and the other one in a town called Dan. So there you have it. Jeroboam has made this decision. He thinks it's the right decision. It's going to keep his empire together. It's going to keep people from looking longingly at Jerusalem and going back to visit there. And so he thinks he's solved his problem. Well, we go on in the next verses in 1 Kings just to find out that this thing became a sin. For the people went before the one as far as Dan. And he, that is Jeroboam, made houses on high places and made priests from among all the people who were not Levites. He's compounding his problem. He did this in Bethel, sacrificing the calves which he had made. He stationed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made. Then he went up to the altar which he had made in Bethel to burn incense. All right. So probably you're already sensing what this has to do with Amos chapter 7. But now something has been done, and the consequences will follow. You can see that it's Jeroboam the first who establishes shrines at Dan and Bethel around 931 BC. We just read this story in 1 Kings chapter 12. But it's interesting and important to note that it's Jeroboam the second who is the key figure in Amos chapter 7. He has turned 169 years later, roughly, he has turned Dan and Bethel into royal sanctuaries. He's got his own priest there. Remember Amaziah, whom Amos stood up to? He's the priest there. And so here we have the situation now where 169 years later, Jeroboam II is using these two sites for the purposes for which Jeroboam I established them. Because the situation is still the same. The kingdom is divided, as you can see. Got a northern and southern kingdom, and you can see Bethel and Dan and how strategic they are. He picked a very southern place and a very northern place. Dan is quite remote. And so between the two, everyone in the northern kingdom should have easy access to these shrines. And so these are crucial sites. And so this is what Jeroboam I was anticipating, and this is what Jeroboam II is actually acting on. Now, let me show you a few pictures of the site at Dan. We don't have pictures of Bethel. Bethel can't be quite as well excavated because it's an occupied town, and most of what's good there archaeologically is under houses and that kind of thing. Further, it's in a Muslim community that's not interested in this kind of excavation. Anyway, at Dan, here's a picture of the high place at Dan. This should give you a feel. This is a real place, okay? You can see an archaeological crew is there. And then in a little bit of a close-up, you can see the high place has been excavated and the stones found. And then there's even a canopy structure that was discovered that would be like a judge's bench for a ruler or someone who's come around to hear cases and that kind of thing, and that might be where the judge would sit. And then we have the high place from a different angle, and you can see on the left side that there's a reconstructed horned altar. I'll give you a close-up in just a moment. It had to be reconstructed, obviously, so it's made of 2x4s and that kind of thing, but they found the spot where it would have been located, and they built it to the right dimensions and put horns on it, so there it is. That would give you an idea of the high place related to the horned altar. Here we have, again, the high place, and there you can see the reconstructed horn altar. Another view, the Dan's high place, and there's the reconstructed horned altar. Again, just giving you different angles. You see the size of it. There's a guy standing next to it, and he's not just a little tiny person, so you can get an idea of just how big this is. And finally, one more, there was also auxiliary rooms for the priests and for supplies, to keep animals in there, to keep kindling, to for the priests to have a place to stay and that kind of thing. And these are off to the side of the high place. So I just wanted to show you a little bit about that so you get an idea of the site itself. And this can be visited very easily if you go to Israel. So if we've read through the prophetic book, we may have skipped over some verses that actually mention these places. For instance, Amos 3:14. Amos, speaking for God, says, I will punish the altars of Bethel. Now, when you read that ordinarily without looking at a map or not knowing any of this history, it's just not that important. It's just like a meaningless nonsense verse almost. He could have said, I'll punish the altars of I can't think of it, Caesarea Philippi or some other place, it could be anything. But it's Bethel that he singles out. And he does it again when he mentions also Gilgal, which is not far from Bethel, and which was also located in an area that was very popular for prophetic activity and false prophets as well. And then he mentions in chapter 5, don't go to Bethel and don't come to Gilgal, nor cross over to Beersheba. Look down on the bottom there. You can see way down in the south in the desert is Beersheba. And so don't go down there either, which is an important site in the history of Abraham. And in chapter 8, those who swear by the guilt of Samaria. Samaria is now the capital by the time of Jeroboam II. And who say, as your God lives, O Dan, and as the way of Beersheba lives. So you can see these places are mentioned, and it's important to look at them on a map and get a feeling for where they are and why they might be singled out. It's not just Amos who does this, by the way. Hosea, for instance, who's a contemporary of Amos. Don't go up to Beth Gilgal or Beth Aven. Notice Beth Aven there. Well, what is Beth Aven? Beth Aven is a derisive term for Bethel. Bethel means house of God. And often in scripture, they would call Bethel, because it's a place of idolatry, they would call it Beth Aven, which means not house of God, but house of wickedness or house of evil or house of sorrow or something like that. So it's kind of a sarcastic renaming of Bethel. And then again in chapter 9, verse 15, all their evil is at Gilgal. Thus it will be done to you at Bethel because of your great wickedness. And then even a little later during the Babylonian period, Jeremiah will refer to Dan and the mountains of Ephraim. That's like a mountain range that you see there. So all of these are places that the prophets single out for a variety of reasons. And they want their readers to be aware that judgment is coming upon these places and that what's the activities at these places are very evil. So decisions have consequences. After the time of Jeroboam I, for instance, you can even look in Strong's Concordance or something like that, and you'll see that in 1st and 2nd Kings, 30 times roughly, there's a phrase, the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. That's a lot of references. Seems like everybody later on references back to Jeroboam I and refers to the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who was Jeroboam I. So God roared in Amos's ear, and the odor of the sin of Jeroboam I was such a stench 169 years later in the nostrils of God that the prophet Amos was sent to Bethel to castigate Jeroboam II for his despicable violation of God's covenant. And so to the question, why is Amos bothering to go to Bethel? What's important about the site? Who cares about King Jeroboam II? Who's this guy, Amaziah? All of that is important in the context of what's going on. And Amos recognizes that and realizes that this place is a vile, despicable place where terrible things are happening. And he's reflecting God's disgust with what is going on at Bethel. But I'm going to back off from this a little bit because I want us to understand that Amos and the prophetic books really open up a whole panorama for us, the incredible breadth of Scripture. Sometimes we'll read portions, like we'll read the book of Genesis or maybe some prophetic books, and we'll have them in a spot in the Bible and not always taking the time to try to figure out, well, how does it fit into this broader picture? You see, the Bible's telling a story. And it's an incredible story with incredible breadth. And I want to close tonight, and I'll probably have to pick up with some of this next week. I won't finish it tonight. But I want us to think now about this panorama. You see, the prophetic books remind us that God uses bad decisions of godless people to accomplish his amazing cosmic and eternal objectives. Do you find that encouraging? I find that incredibly encouraging. We can look around us all the time, at any time you want, and see bad decisions being made by godless people. And we get caught up in that and forget that God is working to accomplish his amazing purposes. And in fact, during spiritually and morally dark periods, God is always actively engaged and on the move. And I want to throw in this term here, the ambidextrous God. I know that sounds a little bizarre, but I'll explain it in a moment. He's intending to use these very events that we've been looking at of the Assyrian and Babylonian and Persian period to accomplish purposes of staggering enormity. What do we learn from the prophetic books? We learn that God has not been incapacitated. And it's not just that he's dealing with immediate situations like we see in Amos or any of the other prophets, but he has not been incapacitated from his long-range vision and his great plans. He thinks broadly and he thinks long. And so his vision is broad and long. And let's not isolate the prophetic books and marginalize it so there's just this chunk of 17 books that don't tie in with the larger scope of God's story. So if we're going to see the breathtaking scope of the story of the Bible, we really need to appreciate the prophetic books, and we need to lay a foundation. That's what I'm trying to do here, is lay a foundation so that these books take on renewed meaning and significance. So let me start tonight. And as I said, I'm not going to finish this tonight, and we'll complete it next week. But let me just start by saying that I want to give 4 premises, and they may seem like no-brainers, but they really set the stage for what's driving God in the prophetic books. What is God's theology that he brings to the time of the prophets? And so we can start with this. Well, the world and its inhabitants all belong to him. That's his premise. That's how he's operating. God is thinking that way. And everything he does has that as a premise. And we see that in passages like this, where we're reminded constantly that the world and everything in it, every person, it all belongs to God. Now, everybody here knows that, but at the same time, don't we forget that sometimes? Don't we forget that it's God's world? Don't we forget that he cares about every person in his world, and he cares about everything in his world? He made it, and so it's his, and it's important to him. So that's a starting premise. All of our theology, all of our reading of the Bible has to carry that with us. The second premise is he intends to bless every one of his ethnic groups in his world. Every one of his ethnic groups in his world. The ethnic groups belong to him. It's his world. It's all his. And he has made a decision to bless all of them. And we see that stated, for instance, in Genesis 12:3, as well as Matthew 28:19. This is God's intent, to bless every one of his ethnic groups in his world. The third premise, God moves his people around at his discretion in his world to position them to receive blessing. In other words, he's not just saying, I want to bless, but he's got a strategy for blessing. He locates people in strategic places so they will be best positioned to receive his blessing. And by the way, everybody on this Zoom call, that's true of us as well. Where you are is where God has moved you and placed you to receive his blessing and to dispense blessing. This idea is stated in Acts 17 when Paul preaches in Athens. He's actually quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 32. But you see the idea there is that God, who owns his world and and the people in it belong to him, has decided to bless them all, and to bless them, he puts them in strategic places. And now we're going to come to the crux, the fourth and final premise. This premise is so crucial. It's what I call the left hand of God. That's why I speak of God's ambidexterity. What do I mean by the left hand of God? I don't know if you have heard of this or not. If you haven't, I didn't make it up. It's Martin Luther was the earliest that I have found who talked about this. And he understood the spiritual ministry of the church and the proclamation of the gospel as God's right hand. So God is at work, and he's at work with his right hand, proclaiming truth through his people and using his people. But very cleverly, Luther further elaborated on this idea by saying that God has a left hand, and it's his left hand where he will use culture, government, and other earthly institutions to restrain evil, to enable his right hand to succeed. If you follow that logic of Luther's there, it's pretty profound thought. We may all know this idea, but to have it articulated so well for us like Luther has done helps us then to begin to ask the right questions about God's word, and especially the prophetic books and what God is up to. So with that in mind, I want to give you 6 evidences of God's left hand at work. And this will help us then to see what was going on during the prophetic books period. Then we can step back and say, oh man, that's amazing what God was doing and how God does his work. I won't get through all 6 tonight. As I said, I'll finish them next week, but let's jump in and let's get started. 6 evidences of God's left hand at work. And the first evidence we've already been wrestling with, which is the rise of Assyria and Babylon and the subsequent deportations that brought Jews into relational proximity to Gentiles. That is, God wanted his people to be on mission, and to be on mission, they had to have contact with Gentiles. And they were relatively isolationist. Of course, they were also pretty much idolatrous. And so it was necessary to deport them because of their sin, but also because this would the byproduct of the deportations would be that they would be brought into relational proximity to Gentiles. So if we were to step back and take a look at the world of the ancient Near East, we can talk about how the diaspora, that's a Greek word that means dispersion, how the diaspora prepared the world for Jesus's arrival. In other words, there's a long view to what's going on in the prophetic books, and it's looking towards the fullness of times when God will send forth his son. So what was the world like during the time period that we're talking about? Well, we have isolationists, idolatrous, and faithful Jews. A bit of a mix. And we have pagan, idolatrous, Gentile society, and they are existing side by side, sometimes have to overlap, but not pleasantly and certainly not intentionally. So what happened? The exile took place. Assyrian, Babylonian exile. And Israel is sent where they are forced to live in relational proximity to Gentiles. What happens when that takes place? Well, not always good stuff, but there are some good things that happen. For instance, you have pagan, devout, and Hellenized Jews that are living now in the Gentile world. I don't know if that strikes you as significant, but think how important that is. Hellenized means world by the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries that is influenced by Greek culture and language. And now you've got these Jews who've been sent away because of their sin, are living in this society. Some of them, the Jews, are pagan, some are devout. Some of them have been Hellenized and influenced by the Greek culture. In addition, you have some Gentile proselytes to Judaism. See what's happening? As Jews are dispersed out into the known world, they are coming in contact with Gentiles, and Gentiles are seeing something that they find attractive and appealing in Jewish religion and worship, and they are proselytized to Judaism. In the book of Acts, these guys are called God-fearers. For instance, Cornelius is a Gentile proselyte to Judaism. Well, how does this fit into a long view? Well, the long view takes us back because, see, this is plugging into a big story of what God is doing. That story, for our purposes, began in Genesis chapter 12. When God launched his right hand, Israel was sent on mission. And so out of that, then, Israel becomes the right hand of God to proclaim the truth of who God is. And that's what this tuning fork is telling us. Israel is supposed to be on mission as God's right hand. Prophet Isaiah says, you are a light to the nation, calls Israel a light to the nation. And so rather than simply looking at Israel as God's people, but without a mission or a clear purpose, their purpose was very clear. It's clearly stated by God in Genesis chapter 12, and the prophets understood that quite clearly. Well, in his sovereignty, God is also not only having a right hand, but he is raising up a left hand because he wants to facilitate this. He wants Israel to be effective. He wants his mission to be effective. And so because of that, he uses his left hand to strengthen the effectiveness of his right hand. And when we see these nations serving that purpose, God is using these nations to discipline his people. He's using these nations to be places where his people can live and shine as a light to these nations. And so the effectiveness of the right hand of God, Israel on mission, is enhanced when they are compelled to live amongst the Gentiles in the Gentile world. As we said, we call this the diaspora. This is the dispersion. And this dispersion is really just a word that's very common, and we get the word dispersion from the word diaspora. 1 Peter 1:1, Peter talks about believers who have been scattered, and he uses that actual word. And so we have this diaspora where from Jerusalem we have the nation of Judah and Israel sent out throughout the ancient Near East. And then we have, that's the Assyrian exile. And then we have Daniel's deportation in 606 BC, where he is sent to Babylon. And by the way, Ezekiel will also spend his captivity there. And so what's happened here is that you have Jews now who are everywhere in the ancient world. And next week, we'll learn about how by the time of the 1st century AD, when Christ comes and then the apostles preach that in basically every city in the Roman Empire, there's a synagogue and there's the presence of God's people. Now, I'm going to stop there for tonight because our time is up. And as I said, I'm going to, in a moment, I'll close in prayer, and then we'll can unmute our mics and take the PowerPoint down and have some Q&A together, and interested in your questions and your observations on this. But next week, we will finish this left hand of God material so we can get the picture of what's going on, and then we'll move right into the book of Hosea. So that's where we are tonight, and I want to pray, and then we'll do some Q&A. If you have to leave, I understand. Thank you for joining us. Everyone who's joined tonight, I'm very appreciative of that. And remember that this presentation, this lesson will be on the YouTube channel probably in just a couple of days. So let's pray together.